World MS Day, we thought it was fitting to look into the psychological impacts of multiple sclerosis, which are perhaps less recognised and accepted than the physical. But because 2.8 million people worldwide live with MS, it's a significant number of people. So wherever you are in the world, your experiences of MS can be quite aligned. We have a whakatauki, a proverb here in New Zealand, Māori proverb, which is he waka iki noa. It means we are all paddling together without exception. So thank you for joining us tonight from around the world. If MS Auckland is your local organisation, you might consider making a small donation to mark World MS Day. Otherwise, please do so for whoever your local community support is. So the format for tonight's session will be an informal talk of our wonderful speakers. If you have any questions, please just pop them into the Q&A box, and any questions that are remaining at the end will be covered. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Rebecca Maguire, who is an associate professor at Maynooth University in Ireland. I will let her fully talk to you about the MS context of her work, but she's globally recognised, and it's a real privilege to have her here this evening. Also joining us is Brett Drummond, Director of MStranslate, Science Communicator, that we really proudly work with as well to help bring science and research to the MS community. So I will let you two get on with it, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So welcome everyone. Just to echo Nicola's statements, thank you for joining us on your Tuesday evening or Tuesday morning, depending on where you might be in the world. I'm very lucky and fortunate to be joined on this webinar by Dr. Rebecca Maguire, who I had the privilege of meeting last year in Barcelona at the ECTRIMS conference, and we had a really good chat about the work that she does. And when we were discussing this webinar and the topic of this webinar, Rebecca immediately sprung to mind as someone that I wanted to get involved, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you again and sort of sharing your work and insights into this topic with the MS Auckland community. For people who are watching, if you have joined some of our recent webinars, the format is going to be very similar. We're going to be chatting away about a variety of different topics, but as we do so, please do feel free to drop any questions that you might have in the Q&A box. I'll be monitoring that as we go through, and as questions arise that may be relevant to what we're talking about, we'll bring them up and chat about them during the broadcast itself. We will also make sure that we leave a bit of time at the end of the session to do some Q&A then as well. So without further ado, Rebecca, thank you for joining us. I think, as Nicola said, it makes sense to start with you giving a bit of an introduction to yourself. And I guess, as we talked about when we met in Barcelona, you've got quite a unique story in terms of how you've come to do this research, and quite a personal connection that sort of led you along the way. So maybe as a starting point, would you mind sharing that with our audience tonight?
Oh yes, delighted to be here. Thanks. Thank you so much to both you and Nicola for the invitation to be here today. So my professional background is I'm an academic. I'm a researcher in psychology, as Nicola said, in a university in Ireland. So I'm very interested in exploring, say, mental health impacts that a chronic illness can have on an individual. So even though I've a bit of a different background, I started doing work in psycho-oncology just over a decade ago, maybe at this stage, and very interested in, say, how an illness can impact, like cancer can impact patients and also family members as well. But around the same time, it's probably the same in New Zealand and globally, but there's been a movement over the last few years of valuing the patient voice in research. So in other words, when people are carrying out research, that we listen to the patient as well in shaping research priorities. In Ireland, we call this something PPI, which is public and patient involvement, but it has other terms, engaged research, maybe in other parts of the world. So I kind of almost had a light bulb moment then. I said, well, actually, hang on, I have another identity that I haven't really brought to my research, but maybe there's something there that I could explore. So perhaps like many of you on the call here today, I also have been living with MS for a number of years. And I was diagnosed with MS really prior to almost the start of my research career when I was doing my PhD. I got diagnosed before I got my formal PhD viva. But I kept this part of my life secret for quite some time. I separated my professional and my personal identities. And I'd say that resonates with some other people here listening today. But I guess it was probably about, when was it? About 2019. I just decided, hang on a minute, maybe I can bring my personal identity to my own research. So I started exploring various different projects in MS, and now the current day I have a number of different projects ongoing. So I'm delighted kind of to be able to contribute to MS research, both in the kind of professional capacity, but also giving the patient voice too.
And so I guess for you making that decision, there was obviously a lot to making that decision. One, obviously having to link that personal lived experience with your professional life. That decision, was it driven by, I guess, a lot of different factors, but how much of it was the fact that maybe there wasn't as much of a focus into the psychological impacts of MS, and as someone living with MS, you really wanted to change that and shine a spotlight on that? But also how much of it was knowing that you could bring a really extra component to the research as someone who understands firsthand what these psychological impacts can be?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not sure what the state of, say, care is like in other countries, maybe like New Zealand, but I know certainly from my own experience, when I was diagnosed, I didn't get any psychological support. You know, you're just given your diagnosis and on the way, and then off you go. And I suppose I didn't really think about it too much at the time, but looking back and reflecting, I'm realizing that it would have been lovely to have a little bit more psychological support, a bit more information, and to help me cope with the diagnosis and deal with the trajectory. So, you know, as Nicola was saying at the start of the seminar, there is, of course, as there should be, a lot of attention paid to the physical impacts of MS and the range of symptoms that people experience. But I think there needs to be maybe not as much, but at least equal attention in certain contexts to the mental health impacts as well, because it is a condition that affects every aspect of a person's life. So yeah, that was kind of my thinking behind that and my desire to pursue research in that area in particular.
Yeah. We should also say that for anyone who is watching, also feel free to share comments in the box. Doesn't necessarily have to be a question. If what Rebecca is saying is resonating with your experiences and you feel comfortable sharing those, we won't necessarily read out names of the comments that we see, but we can read them aloud as well. So if you do want to share any of those, we'd be happy also to bring those to Rebecca's attention during this time as well. So your research. Let's start there. I think this is such a huge topic. There are so many things that we could talk about. Let's talk about the areas of research that you've sort of focused on. Can you share where your specific interests lie in this field?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate to work with a lot of wonderful collaborators as well, and I've got some PhD students in MS, which I'm delighted. I feel really privileged to be in that position to actually be able to conduct and lead research in MS. So I have a few different things I'm interested. So from the individual perspective, I'm leading at the moment a general project in Ireland, which is looking at the development of provision of mental health supports for people with MS. And that's just in the early stages because, there's a need, certainly in our context in Ireland, to understand the supports that are available for people like at a local level, but also the barriers and facilitators that exist maybe in accessing those supports. But as well as just understanding broadly the range of different mental health challenges that people may have, because we often think about, say, anxiety and depression, but it'd be a lot broader than that. So that's something which I'm doing at the moment, just in the early stages. But I've also led research and supervised research specifically looking at the experience of anxiety and MS and how, for example, that changed over the course of the COVID pandemic. I know that seems like quite a long time away now, but or ago, that was quite a difficult time for a lot of people with MS. And that was work led by a PhD student of mine, Austin Fahy. And also I have another PhD student who's in the final stages of writing up her work, looking at peer support in MS. And we might go on to talk about that a little bit later. But peer support can be quite helpful in terms of enhancing and maintaining psychological well-being for people coping with the various challenges of the condition. But also another kind of personal interest of mine was some research I did in the area of stigma in MS as well. And again, maybe this is partly coming from a personal perspective too, but the fact I mentioned earlier, I kept my diagnosis quiet in a professional setting for many years. And that was probably because I had concerns about experiencing stigma from others, or the fact that people might view me differently. Now I'm in a very different place now, obviously, but I guess I wanted to conduct some research in this area to see how widespread that experience was, and also the factors that predicted stigma. So, there's a number of interesting findings from that research as well. Surprise, surprise, showing that actually a lot of people do have experiences of stigma or have experienced it in their daily lives. And then on the other side that I won't go into detail on all my different projects, but another thing, as I said, I'm interested in the family members as well, and informal carers who often take on the role of informal carers for some people with MS. And I'm always careful to emphasize, obviously, a lot or most people with MS do not need care, but at the same time, just under half will need some kind of informal care and support. So understanding how MS affects the whole family is important as well.
Sounds like you keep very busy. Is my
Yeah, I
first
do keep
comment
very busy, yeah.
is my first
Well,
comment on this.
Yeah.
Quite a few different things. Before we jump into these, because I definitely wanted to talk more about these, just one comment that's come through already, thanking you and saying very well said. The moment of diagnosis is one where psychological help and guidance would be very helpful. So I think we might talk about that a little bit more as well. If you are also listening, obviously Rebecca's just outlined a huge scope of work that she's involved in. If there's any of those topics that you want us to focus on, also feel free to put that in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we talk about that. Let's start with the stigma work, because we talked about that to a very different audience when we were at ECTRIMS, but I think it's definitely of interest to this audience as well. Before we get too far down the road, let's start very basic on it. What do we mean when we say stigma? Because I think we probably all have a bit of a an idea of what we're referring to, but when you're talking about it in terms of your work, what really do you mean by stigma?
So I think that's an interesting question in itself, because part of our research, we wanted to ask people with MS what they feel is stigma and how they've experienced it. But there are also what we call kind of validated scales. So these are questionnaires that exist and that you can give to people to measure levels of stigma. So how other researchers have defined it too. And generally people talk about different types of stigma. People think about stigma that is experienced from others. Some researchers talk about isolation stigma as well, stigma of being kind of left out or excluded by others as well. But also anticipated stigma, which touches upon what I was mentioning earlier. People might fear stigma from others, maybe let's say in an employment context, and that's why they might choose to conceal their MS or the way in which it affects them too. But yeah, part of our research, we were interested in asking people with MS, well, have you experienced stigma, and give some examples of what that is. And we grouped it together. We did, when you do what we call qualitative research in psychology, you can try to develop themes and commonalities among people's responses. And obviously everybody has very different experiences, but we did find some commonalities. And we found, first of all, that stigma, it generally involves people maybe misunderstanding or having some misconceptions as to what MS is. So, other people on the call might have experienced this, but they might say to somebody, "Oh, I have MS," and then the person says, "Oh, I know my friend or my auntie or my second cousin has MS," and then they'll talk about their experience, and it might be totally different, or misunderstanding or what MS will be. But we also found then that experience, which I mentioned before, feeling excluded or maybe being overlooked or feeling isolated, left out. Like there was a lot of experiences of people saying maybe their friends started to treat them differently, or maybe didn't contact them as much as they used to, when this is after disclosure of MS, for example. So that's kind of maybe another example of stigma. And we had other kind of themes, as we say, things like unwanted inputs, unwanted advice, or you should do this, you should exercise more, you should eat better. Maybe when the person didn't necessarily want to receive that kind of information or advice. And also, some people talked about stigma kind of more so from healthcare professionals as well, like almost a medical disregard as well. And maybe some in an employment context, maybe lack of accommodations, going back to that whole issue of lack of understanding. But actually, interestingly, in our research too, we found that the biggest source of stigma was from oneself. So people were their own worst enemies, as it were. And like I thought that was an interesting finding from the research. So, I mean, I suppose go back to the question, it's quite complex. There's a number of different dimensions and a number of different experiences that people might have with stigma, and it can come from many different sources. So often the stereotype of stigma is it's experienced from other people, but to understand that it can come from oneself as well, is quite interesting, I think.
Yeah. I guess one thing with it is that and coming from what you're saying there, we probably think a little bit of stigma as always coming from a place of negativity, that, people are deliberately trying to stigmatize someone, but it sounds like it's not always that. It's just, people can be trying to help, but that help that they're giving is unwanted, and that can lead to this problem. It can be through being, a lack of awareness or, not necessarily being informed, and so it can come at you in lots of different ways. And I guess that probably makes it in a way even harder to deal with for the individual. Is that sort of what you found as well?
Yeah, I thought, and there was kind of two different things that came across in relation to that too. Some people didn't like the feeling of being pitied, being almost
Mhm.
infantilized, saying, "Oh, you mind yourself, you shouldn't do this," or and they're like, "Well, actually, I can do this. I'm still independent. I'm still autonomous." But on the other hand, and this could happen simultaneously for the same person, um, they didn't like the people maybe were disregarding them. And again, this comes up a lot in MS with the invisible nature of the symptoms, because a person can look fine and then, or maybe, the fluctuating nature of, let's say, something like fatigue. So one day a person may be perfectly able to perform at a very high level, let's say, in their job and do lots of things and juggle. And then the next day they're absolutely exhausted, but they look the same from the outside observer. So a person then might feel that they're being disregarded. That, if somebody says, "Well, you were able to do X, Y, Z yesterday, why can't you do it today?" So it's kind of that simultaneously,
Mhm.
some people may not like feeling pitied or being or too much help, but on the other hand, being disregarded, or their needs being disregarded as well. So
Yeah.
like there are different experiences, and I think and some of those might resonate with people, not everybody. And I think as important, it's always important to emphasize in any research with MS is that everybody has their own unique experiences. And what we do in research is we try to look for trends and we try to look for commonalities. But I'm always mindful to say that just from, say, some participants have experienced this, it doesn't mean it's the same for others.
Mhm.
Um, and there's lots of positive findings coming out from that particular study as well. Even positive, we ask people about positive experiences of disclosing their MS and feeling supported, and not letting it, or others maybe just not treating them differently, for example. So it's
Yeah.
very individual variable. And people will find that. I know, any person with MS will have experienced lots of different reactions from others if they are open or they disclose their MS.
Mhm.
Um, so it's kind of a mixture of positive and negative. So it's not all one or the other.
Yeah. I think it's really important that you say it's obviously, as with a lot of things in MS, it's a unique experience,
Mm.
but there are these commonalities. And I asked this question with a little bit of hesitation or a little bit of dread because I'm not sure that I want to know the answer necessarily. But from your research, how prevalent was it that people had experienced some level of stigma?
Well, it was interesting that actually 90% of our sample did say they had
Mhm.
experienced stigma at least at one point in their life. And some people, I think I don't have the exact figures to hand right now, but not everybody experienced it very frequently. So we measured it in what we call like a Likert scale. So how frequently do you experience stigma, with one option being never, and then the next one would be, say, seldom or sometimes. So a lot of people say they sometimes experience stigma.
Mhm.
It's kind of maybe about a quarter, I think, said they experience it quite regularly. So it is like it occurs in degrees as well. But also I would always caution with research too. So in our study, it was a kind of a community-based sample of people with MS in lots of different countries. It's not necessarily a representative sample, so it's not like we asked every person with MS these questions. So we always have to be cautious when we
Mhm.
interpret any research findings. I think it's just important to say that. So even though
Yep.
in our study we found only 10% of people never experience stigma, that doesn't necessarily mean to say it's reflective of all people with MS. It's possible that people took part in this study because um, they or maybe are more likely to feel like they had these negative experiences. So I would always just be cautious to anybody when you're interpreting research findings. And that's just our study, but we did have a good sample of people in that study. So we had 250, nearly 300 people.
Yep.
So they are meaningful results. Yeah, in terms of
Yep.
percentages, I'm a bit cautious. Yeah.
Yep. Definitely. I've had another comment shared, just sharing an experience of what they've called, I guess, that medical stigma from the medical profession that you raised as well. I'll just read out what they've said. Going to say, my neurologist in Paris, where I lived for 15 years, said to me, "It's so hard for you living with a sword of Damocles." I found it a ridiculous assumption. I corrected him, saying, "No, I never think that way." So I guess, again, it very well ties into some of the things that you've raised. There's so much I want to keep talking about on this topic. We will get to others. But I guess for people who had experienced stigma, that 90%, what were there sort of meaningful, or I guess significant outcomes that you could measure in terms of the impact that had on them? That, what were the downstream effects for a person living with MS who had experienced stigma?
Well, so we did find that people who experienced stigma or anticipated stigma were more likely to conceal their MS, which isn't surprising then. So people maybe who have those experiences, they're less likely to be open about the way in which MS affects them. And another thing we were looking at in our study was how open people are about various different aspects of their MS, not just the MS per se. Because this is something I was particularly interested in, because a lot of research has looked at how open people are about having a diagnosis of MS. But how open are people about the different symptoms that they experience? I think that's a slightly different thing. And I might actually have a for now that I think of it, I might have a chart, I'll see if I can dig it up while we're talking here, to illustrate what I'm talking about. But I think that I have something here. Maybe it's not the best one, but so I think people, where was I going with that? People, yeah, so that's kind of one of the consequences of stigma. So people aren't always open, and they may not, if people have experienced stigma, sorry, they may not always be open. Apologies again, I haven't had all my coffee. Remember, it's early morning here in Ireland. But we also did look at some of the predictors of stigma as well, and we found that some people were more likely to experience it than others. How do I share, actually? Sorry, is there a way for me to share?
So there should be a button down the bottom that says share, and I think it should work for you to be able to share if you just click on that, it should help give you the option to share whichever screen you want to.
Okay. I'll just share this.
Yep.
So I don't, you can see that. Sorry, I know it's not in slide view, but is that okay? So again, it's I know there's a lot going on in that graph there. But what we found is that people with MS, they may be open about the fact that they have MS, but they may not be open about all the ways in which it affects them. So I think that was interesting finding from our research. And if you look just at the ones at the bottom of the screen, these bottom ones, unsurprisingly, people they're usually seldom open about the fact that they have, say, sexual problems, bowel problems. But what's interesting is mental health problems here as well. So that's kind of the third least problem, let's say, that people might be open to experiencing or sharing there. So I think that's particularly interesting finding from the research. And people who maybe have experienced stigma are less likely to be open about various different issues that they experience. So the green is kind of people are always open about their problems. So even something like mobility problems, very few people are always open about the problems that they might be experiencing there too. So yeah, that's interesting, I think.
Well, I think what's interesting, if we just leave that up for a second, I think if I'm looking at this graph as well, that it sort of also follows the order of how you would see these symptoms probably talked about in a medical appointment with a neurologist. And so how much of this do you think is also, it's tied back to how much an individual has it communicated to them is also linked to, so, mobility problems is something that they're going to hear about from their neurologist. It's going to form a large part of an appointment. And so that normalizes the conversation around those symptoms versus, say, something like mental health. Like at the start, you said it's not really something when, you were diagnosed that came up as part of the conversation at all. I want to make sure as we go through this, obviously we're talking about things that can happen. I want to make sure that we talk about what are some potential solutions to this, or what are the things that we know can help on this. How much do you think actually just normalizing talking about some of these things could help shift this graph a little bit?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You're right. And to think about that, maybe it comes back to that initial point of care from the healthcare professional's perspective. Even just, I suppose, at the starting point, giving people information that let's say these are some of the symptoms that are experienced or can be experienced by people with MS. Obviously, not everybody is going to experience them all, but just going back to that whole idea of raising awareness, what we found is that biggest theme that came across from our participants is that maybe they misunderstood or had misconceptions, or others had misunderstandings or misconceptions. So raising awareness of what MS actually can involve, that it can involve some of these symptoms. And of course, that's not an exhaustive list either. We did have an option for people to mention other symptoms and whether they were open about them as well. So yeah, I think starting from that place is important. But I just think, and most people with MS will understand this and this will resonate with them. Is that, you might be open, you might say, oh, I live with MS, but because of the fact that a lot of the symptoms that you experience can't be seen, you're not open, or maybe you don't, and people, of course, don't need to be open about every symptom in every context either. It's not always a required thing to be open about all the different symptoms. But I suppose even raising awareness at a more public level too, the fact that if the person has MS, they may be experiencing many of these different symptoms. And therefore they might need a little bit more understanding, maybe a bit more support in places too.
Yeah, I think it's a big thing for people living with MS. I think it's also a big thing in the community in general, that we need to get a better understanding of all of this and normalize having conversations and making it something that we talk about more. Thank you for sharing that. I think that was really helpful to be able to see. One of the things that you mentioned, going on to another one of your projects, but I think is quite linked, and I think that's what we're seeing already as part of this discussion, as this is a network of things. Sorry, as I knock my microphone over. Is anxiety as something that people living with MS experience. And you sort of mentioned that the experiencing stigma or the anticipation of experiencing stigma can also then lead to anxiety. What have you found in terms of anxiety in people living with MS? Because we know, I think a lot of people hear the general stats of people living with MS are more likely to experience anxiety than people in the general population. But beyond that, I think that's almost where the conversation tends to stop. So what do we know, about anxiety in people living with MS?
Yeah, and so as they say, yeah, the headline figures, it is more common than compared to the general population. If we think about it, it probably makes sense because MS is associated with a lot of uncertainty. And when people have uncertainty about aspects of their life, and that could be like on a daily basis, like, are certain symptoms going to flare up today? Or it could be looking more into the long term, into the future. So that would be associated with maybe feelings of anxiety and worries, I suppose, worries about the future and worries about what might happen. So it actually makes sense, makes sense that people with MS will have these experiences. I guess it's concerning if it starts getting to a point where it's really interfering with people's everyday life. Like a lot of these, when we talk about these mental health concepts or terms like anxiety, depression, they do have, and stigma as well. It does happen on a degree, but if it goes over a certain threshold, that can be concerning, and it's very, very important that if people are really troubled by feelings of anxiety, that they do reach out for support. And there's lots of different supports, and I know, I'm sure local MS societies like in Auckland would offer sources of support. So that's really important to say at the first instance. But we know as well that there are lots of different predictors of people's likelihood of experiencing, say, anxiety. Some research has found it's more common, say, in women than maybe in men or other genders. So that kind of is a trend across different diseases, not just MS. Also, some research suggests that experience of anxiety and other psychological difficulties might vary depending on a person's level of, say, disability or their own health too, as well, which also makes sense. But the kind of thing, the research that we conduct, I'm particularly interested in looking at things like the psychological and social factors can play in anxiety. So one concept which is spoken about a lot in research in health psychology is something called self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is really a person's confidence in their ability to control aspects of their lives. So kind of just it's self-confidence. So I can do this. I'm going to be able to tackle my day-to-day. And people who have a higher sense of self-efficacy tend to have a lower sense of anxiety. And another thing is people that have higher levels of social support too. People having social support around them tend to have lower experience of anxiety. So if we think about something like anxiety, it can be predicted by your kind of demographic factors that maybe you can't really change, or your health status, you can't really change that, but there are things about maybe your the way in which you cope with situations and strategies which you use every day, and the sources of support that you can seek and rely on. And these are things that maybe can lead to more positive outcomes, not just in anxiety, but in other kind of mental health conditions as well.
Yep. And I think one of the ones that you've already mentioned a little bit is around peer support. And as we, I guess, are leading up to World MS Day, a day where we sort of come together as a global MS community, the understanding for people that they're not alone, that there are other people who may be experiencing similar things, or even if they're experiencing different things, can still come together and have a level of understanding. How important is that to be able to have, I think having those networks around you, but especially potentially having a network of people who are going through similar experiences. How important is that for people living with MS?
It can be very, very important. But the first thing to say is not everybody feels the need to have peer support as well. Like that's the thing. That's what we found from our own research too. Is that, like, obviously a lot of people with MS would really love the opportunity to engage more with peers, but some people say, I don't need peer support. So that's what as well we have to think about. Okay, well there's a certain cohort maybe don't want to engage, maybe either don't want to or don't need to. However, I do think, a larger cohort of people really do find value in peer support. Because even having the ability to say, that slide that I shared earlier, having the ability to talk about the unique symptoms and problems that maybe people, other people with MS can understand and experience, that can be quite validating, and that can be, just very helpful in itself, sharing those experiences, being able to share it, validate, but also to get information. And peer support can take many different forms. So it can take the forms of kind of in-person supports where people maybe meet up at events that are organised maybe by local organisations. Or sometimes there might be formal peer support meetup groups, but it can also happen online. I mean, even in a case of webinar, I always find taking part in these webinars myself personally, I find that a useful source of peer support too, because even hearing some of the comments you're reading out, Brett, it's really nice to hear that people have experienced things that I say of a person with MS have experienced too. And to understand that we're not alone and there are a lot of commonalities, no matter where you're living in the world, that can be really helpful. And even you see people online in terms of engaging in things like maybe Facebook groups or Reddit threads or whatever it might be. Some people get peer support that way too, and that can be a little easier to navigate sometimes for somebody that may not want to be up front and center. Because one thing from the research which my PhD student Joan led was that actually sometimes it can be quite intimidating for, say, a newly diagnosed person with MS to go to a session when there's maybe a lot of people, let's say with advanced progressive MS, for example, and that can be quite scary for a newly diagnosed person to be. And I was actually one of those people too. When I was diagnosed, I was like 25. And that was one of the first events that I went to, and I found it quite scary, again, leading to those anxieties. So sometimes thinking about the types of setting, the type of peer support is important. People might want to talk to people who are at a similar stage, similar life stage, sorry, I should say, to them. Whether it be with other, let's say, parents of young children, maybe or maybe an older cohort, or people who are working or not working. People have different identities. So there's different types of peers, I guess, as well. So everybody has their own different preferences and needs. But I think it boils down to the fact that most people will derive some benefit from that peer support. But of course, there's a broader social network as well of support that's important. Going back to what I was saying before, the wider family as well can be useful, and colleagues and employers, if people are working, that is, we can draw a lot of strength, I suppose, from those support networks in different contexts.
Yeah. Just a quick note to our audience, we are coming towards the end of our discussion. So if you do have questions, we'll be setting aside some time. So if you do want to ask Rebecca a question before we finish up, please do put them into the Q&A box now, and we'll make sure that we try and answer as many as we can before we finish up. I think from what you were saying there, what's clear is what people need may be different to each other. It may also change over time. What someone may need 6 months after a diagnosis may be different to what they need 5 years after a diagnosis, and that's all going to be a fluid process. But probably what I think we can agree on, or what I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on, I guess more as the expert in the area, is that finding at least someone to talk about these things to, if you find that you are struggling with something in the psychological space, is always better than bottling it up and trying to handle it yourself, whether that's loved one, a family member, someone else with MS, a professional support. Would we encourage everyone to try and make sure that they can find someone to talk to if they need to?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Knowing where, and even just knowing where you can go if you need it in the future. That's the thing. And that's often quite reassuring for people, I think, sometimes to know where they can get support if they need it. Because a lot of us may not need it now, but maybe in the future we will, or we might be having a bad day, or a symptom might be flaring up, or we might have had a negative experience, and then even just being able to vent about it and to rant on. I mean, I always find that quite helpful.
Yep. I am certainly partial to a rant myself at different times about different things, and it does tend to help. So beyond peer support, in terms of general, psychological well-being, and I think, there is no one definition of what perfect mental health looks like. It's, it's something that we're always trying to obtain, and those goalposts change. But what other things can people be doing to try and improve, their mental health on a sort of daily basis?
Yeah, so there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of different things, I suppose, that can contribute to an mental health, of course. And these are the commonly known factors that would apply for everybody, regardless of whether they have MS or not, of course. That would include things like maybe lifestyle is spoken about a lot in the context of MS, and things like engaging in exercise. But obviously, not everybody maybe will have the ability to engage in rigorous physical exercise, but some form of exercise, depending on what you're capable of, I guess, and lifestyle. Fatigue is a big issue for nearly every person with MS. So knowing how to manage fatigue and strategies to put in place for that, which is a whole other area which we can't go into today, of course. But that, of course, will have knock-on implications for it. I mean, we already mentioned seeking social support and peer support being really important. But at an individual level, there's other kind of psychological constructs that would be known in the context of MS to be quite helpful. So I mentioned self-efficacy, which is, again, just building confidence in yourself. And also acceptance of MS as well. That's another big thing, and that's something people can struggle with, but accepting, that you have MS. And that knowing, okay, well, this is a boundary in which I have to operate in now, and building that strength. We talk about as well self-management, which is just, again, these things are all quite common, or there's a lot of overlap. It's just understanding, well, what can I do? What factors do I have control over in my life? Are there changes I need to make? Are there things that might make my life a little bit easier? All these things would have the ultimate consequence of maybe enhancing your well-being. Obviously, then there are more formal psychological supports that people can engage in if they need to. Sometimes there are groups that might be offered by different MS societies or different healthcare settings. They can be delivered maybe in person or online as well, like I said before. So say psychological interventions such as cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, has been shown to be quite effective. And mindfulness is another thing. Sometimes there's a lot of work done on mindfulness in the context of MS, mindfulness-based interventions. So, there's different things. There's other therapeutic interventions like acceptance and commitment therapy. But also I do think kind of getting information, as much information as possible can be useful for some people, not necessarily getting all the information, but sometimes just having answers to questions that you might have. There's different online programs as well, like Living with MS or Coping with Chronic Health Conditions, that might be available. So there are a lot of resources, of course, available. So people maybe could be encouraged to look, and I'm sure maybe there are supports from MS Auckland that could be highlighted. I'm not sure if they could be flagged. So there's a collection of things, I suppose, that can help. But I think just being aware of one's needs for support, it's really important too. Oh, I see. I actually can see in the chat there, MS Auckland's next webinar is fatigue management. Perfect. Okay, so that will do that. It's really important too. Yeah, so there's a few different things. I'm not sure if that answers.
No, it definitely does. I mean, it definitely does. And I think one of the themes that's coming through really clearly is that this is something that we just want people to be proactive about. There is support out there, and we need to make people aware that there is support out there, and then for people to reach out and not feel like they need to go through it alone. And there are, things that can be done to try and minimize some of these things. I know one that's come out quite recently is around sleep. We know that people living with MS suffer from sleep dysfunction, and we know that people who have poorer sleep quality, that can, have impacts on psychological health, increased rates of depression and things like that. But there are ways to then, you can treat the sleep part of it, and then that can have impacts on mental health downstream. So I think the idea here is that it should be something that we're talking more about. We did have a question, and I don't know if this is something that you will be able to answer, but we'll go through. Do you know if any of the disease-modifying therapies are linked with increased rates of depression or anxiety in people living with MS?
I don't know. I can't say that offhand. Often, the research suggests that, they suggest there's a kind of a positive impact for well-being, if you're undergoing DMTs. But yeah, I can't say with authority whether there is any difference, because there's so many different trials and so many different studies that go on. But one thing as well, just, I suppose on that note, often, anxiety and depression are listed as like secondary outcomes when they do clinical trials. They obviously are trying to look at improvements in, mobility or EDSS. But then sometimes a lot of these trials will say, well, like almost as an add-on, a secondary point, oh, anxiety and depression. Or, like it's really important, I think, for us all to start thinking about those as really important, like primary outcomes, quality of life. It's what people with MS want to see.
Yeah, I don't think from anything that I've seen that there's anything suggesting any increased rates. Same as you. I think if anything, it would be the other way. We do know that, some of these psychological issues are also linked to inflammation in the brain. So, the treatments treating that inflammation theoretically will also then have a positive impact on trying to reduce some of these psychological issues, but definitely nothing that I've seen that indicates increased rates with any of the DMTs. The question that's just come through, we'll wait until Nicola's back on. So I'm going to finish off with one question to you, which is a big question and almost impossible to answer, but that's how I like to finish everyone, by asking the hardest question last. What in your ideal world, what does psychological support look like for a person living with MS? So let's start with it at the point of diagnosis. What do you hope, when a person gets given that diagnosis, what should that conversation involve to ensure that from that moment on, this is something that, they're aware of? I did say it was a hard question.
No, not the hard one, and I probably won't answer it in as straightforward a way as you would like, because going back to what I was saying, people's needs are very different, and it's about being sensitive to those needs as well. So some people will really embrace all the information that they can get. So making sure that's available to them if they so wish. So again, flagging the different resources and supports that are available would be really important. But at the same time, sometimes people might be diagnosed and they might take a little bit of time to process, and they may not necessarily want to suddenly engage in a lot of, individual therapy or group-based therapy, for example. They may not need that, they may not want it. So I don't think it's easy to say, yes, everybody who's diagnosed should get X, Y, Z. But I think having the information and the supports there available to them is important. Like in what we found out, I found from talking to others as well, is that sometimes people's needs for support might vary, and later on in the diagnosis, well, it might be only, 5, 10, 15 years into diagnosis, but then a person says, well, actually, I think I could do with some support now, I could do with some help. So obviously at point of diagnosis, it's really important, but actually understanding that needs might change across the MS trajectory is really important too. So having supports available across at all stages of condition, at all ages, is really important. And always being open, I suppose having peer support, let's say programs that are open to people at any stage, would be really valuable.
I think that was a perfect answer to what was a difficult question. I'll invite Nicola back in. I want to thank you, Rebecca, for sharing so many valuable insights on what is a really important topic, but one that's not talked about a lot. We had some more comments in the chat, just sort of reiterating people's experiences with what you were talking about in terms of how they can feel invalidated by comments talking about other people that they know with MS and they're fine. Feeling like it was them, realizing that it was them that was actually stigmatizing themselves about MS. So I think, all of the insights that you've shared have really resonated with the community. And I think a lot of people have taken a lot from this. So thank you for getting up early in the morning in Ireland to share this on a really important topic that we should be talking more about. So thank you very much, Nicola. I will hand over to you.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I didn't even know about self-stigma as a concept, so it's been really eye-opening for me. So thank you so very much. And just to reiterate your points about peer support, so valuable, and the service that we have at MS Auckland, where we have a variety of volunteers from different situations, and when we pair them up like a mentoring really with somebody a little bit further ahead, that can just be journey changing for them. So we have wonderful people who do that, that we're super grateful for. And just please, everybody who's here, know that your MS organisation is also in your corner and waiting for your call, and know that there's good days and bad days, and we really want to be that safety net for you as well, or one of the safety nets that's available. So please never hesitate to reach out to us or to others. So on that note, thank you very, very much, Dr. Rebecca Maguire, Brett Drummond, and to all of you here tonight. Good morning, good evening, and all the very best. Thank you. Pō Marie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.